All right, Pat O'Connor, welcome to the Heart Dealer
Really great. How
podcast.
you
How are
doing,
you?
Chris? That's good.
I'm wonderful. I appreciate your time. I'm happy that we got this set up. Our mutual friend was like, "You have to talk to Pat. It's going to be so interesting. I can't wait to hear this episode."
I don't let you down on that one. So.
I don't believe you. Uh, in your words, because I've got my notes and I can easily ask, but in your words, who is Pat
Well,
O'Connor?
I always so I'm lucky to be passing through. I enjoy music, and I'm married. I've been married now for 41 years, and we have two adult children, both of whom work in the music business now. And great family, great fun, and I get to make a living doing what I enjoy. And I've been presented with a set of opportunities that allows me to do it, which is a blast. I get to do what I love with and for people that I love, which is about as good as it gets.
I agree. Being happy with what you do, helping people, those are kind of
Yeah,
the ultimate
yeah.
goals. So, where'd you grow up? What was family
I
life
was
like?
I was fortunate. I was in a
Life,
great
life.
family. The I grew up just outside Philadelphia. So and I've pretty much lived there for all but 2 years of my life. After I got out of college, I lived in Houston for a couple of years. But for the most part, I've lived in Philly my entire life. I was 23 when I got married, so we've uh, pretty much got things stable. I worked as a musician when I was younger, when I was in late in high school and in college, and I ended up uh, graduating with a degree in biophysics from the University of Penn. It's funny. I turned my phone onto airplane mode and turned it off, and I'm still getting calls coming in. Sorry, but no, I was kind of fortunate. I went to the University of Penn, got a degree in biophysics, ended up working in sales and then in marketing, and uh, from there did that for a few years at Honeywell, for about 5 years at Honeywell, and then I had a couple of opportunities came along where I wrote some songs for some people, and we were able to get a little bit of traction. I was able to develop a small network of relationships in the music business, and then I got lucky. The when they first started putting the scoreboards in the arenas, the hockey arenas, um, they it sounds hard to believe now because when you go to a sporting event now, it's a multimedia sensory overload type of thing. But at the time when I started, when they first put those jumbotrons in, a lot of the teams didn't know what to put on there. They were trying to put advertisements up there. They would put highlights. They were getting pushed by the league to be careful about putting replays up there because they didn't want to, if the ref made a mistake, they didn't want to point out that the ref made a mistake. So they were, in many cases, they were just looking for content. And I thought it would be cool if we could take existing music videos, not just music, but music videos, and intercut them with NHL highlights. And so we did it initially for the Philadelphia Flyers, and Ed Snyder, who owned the Flyers, was kind enough to call Gary Bettman, the commissioner of the NHL, and made the pitch to have POC Media do the same thing for a number of teams. And they gave us an exclusive to do that for a while, as long as I could figure out how to get paid for it. And so we were basically mortgaging the house to get, to be able to get the equipment and the people to be doing what we were trying to do. And all the labels turned us down twice. I figured if I was trying to sell sponsorship, I'd be selling against the teams or against the league, and I already knew who would lose that one. So I figured if we could get record companies who at the time were trying to get a lot of exposure, that I'd have a pretty good chance of being able to create some value. And there were enough record companies at the time. It was before the consolidation in the music business, that I could get a number of labels on board. So every label turned me down a couple times, and then I was fortunate. I was able to get three labels to agree to work with us. And the artists that were on those labels were, in one case it was Foo Fighters, another case it was Bon Jovi, another case it was Shania Twain, and we ended up looking. I'm saying we. It was, at this point it was me, and eventually I hired a couple people, but probably ended up looking smarter than I was to the NHL people, because when your first couple groups are Foo Fighters and Everclear and Bon Jovi and Shania Twain and Terry Clark, and the perception ends up being, wow, these guys have their finger on the pulse, which I really had no idea what we were doing. We were just trying to we were doing what the record companies were asking us to do, but they gave us some pretty hot artists that broke pretty quickly, and we were able to establish, I think, a level of trust with the hockey teams, and then eventually NASCAR, and eventually NFL teams. And once you're in with the NFL, you're in. And then at that point, we started picking up basketball and baseball, a little bit of work with soccer teams and National Hot Rod Association. And so eventually, it got to a point within a couple of years where we had 23, 24 labels working with us. So, and it wasn't that any of them were paying us a whole lot of money, but if you have 23 or 24 of them paying you an okay amount of money, it's a business. And like any business,
Absolutely.
it's very hard to anticipate. The stuff that threatens your business is never the stuff you're anticipating, because you deal with the stuff you anticipate. If you're worried about this changing or that changing, then you deal with it ahead of time. But what we didn't see coming was file sharing, and the
Well, let me
yeah,
let me jump in and interrupt. Only because you've already said so much
yeah,
that I need to unpack. There's so much knowledge and information there, and I'm happy to come back to
sure,
file sharing because for me, entrepreneurship, family, the music industry, these are all things that I love and I need to know more about. Uh, so
yeah.
let's go back a little bit. You're young, you're making music. What are you making? How did you get into music? What was it, a guitar, a piano? Just talk
Yeah,
about your
it's
initial
keyboards.
music.
My grandparents had a little upright piano, and I used to spend a lot of weekends over at my grandparents' house. So I would, I'd see a TV show, and then I was like 5, 6 years old. I could sit down and play the theme to the TV show, and I hadn't taken lessons or anything. It was just, it felt natural. It just kind of came to me. So my thought process at the time was, it was just fun to play, and then I started going to, you start going to concerts when you're younger with your friends and stuff. And I would go see, gosh, like John Denver and the Carpenters and Mac Davis, and a lot of kind of country folk pop type stuff. And then some buddies of mine, I still hang out with the same 9 guys I've hung out with since high school. And they said, oh, we're going to go see Elton John. And I went and saw Elton John, and it was life changing. It was, saw him at the Spectrum. I had never seen anything like it in my life. He comes out. I remember my dad kidding me about it, that he goes, how was the show? And I go, oh, it was amazing. Elton came out, he throws the piano bench off the stage, he's swinging on ropes, he's playing the guitar or playing the piano over his head. And it was, I'd never seen anything like it. My dad's laughing because none of that had anything to do with music. I mean, the guy was also like insanely talented, could sing, could write, could play, but it was just the entertainment factor of a great rock concert just blew me away. And so then I started playing with local bands. Would start playing at high school dances and the VFWs and any place that would let us play. And then from there started doing a little bit of session work. And what I found was, I've never thought of myself as a particularly good keyboard player, but I was sloppy. And the thing is, if you're sloppy but you can feel the pocket when you're playing, it starts to sound like jazz fusion or R&B. Yeah, it's actually just, I have fat fingers, so like I would, you'd be trying to hit like a one chord with the right hand, but you're hitting the 1 and 2 with your thumb, and you're hitting the 4 and 5 with your with your ring finger and your middle finger. And people would hear the chords and go like, what's that chord? And of course I had no idea what the chord was. I don't read sheet music. So what I found is I started getting invited in to play on a lot of stuff, because there was just a different jangly feel to what I was doing. And from doing that, I got to know a lot of people. And then when eventually I ended up writing a song, wrote it for Amy Grant, never made the album, but I won the Best New BMI Songwriter Award with it. And from that, ended up getting to produced some stuff for some people who had record deals, and then eventually, just found myself working with people who I recognized, people that I was a fan of. We did a little bit of work for Kenny Rogers on his Real West series, and um, eventually things just started to snowball to a point where I found that I knew a lot of people. And again, keep in mind, the music business back then was the Wild West. There were no rules, and so some of the people, we were all trying to figure out what we were going to do for a living. Many of them went on to become label presidents and big managers and stuff. And I always say, and sometimes I'll lecture at universities, and I always tell kids when they say, "How do you get to know these people?" It's like you get to know them 20 years before they're these people. You basically, it's all about community. It's all about relationships, and that's even a lot of like what I talk about in the book. It's relationships are going to determine results, and so it's the network of people that you're hanging out with. Both, are they quality people? Are they good people? Are they good at what they do? And are they into the relationships and doing things? So I ended up, that was kind of like getting into the music. It was more just sort of stumbling in and enjoying music and playing. And then eventually what I found was that I could make money doing it, playing in bars and playing in studios. And it just, again, it comes back very similar to what we do now, in the sense that if you have the opportunity, if you're blessed to be around people that you love, and you have an opportunity to make a living doing what you enjoy with and for people that you love, um, it never feels like work. It just always feels like, you get up every morning and you get to do this. So,
So you're falling in love with music. How did you wake up one day and say, you know what, I should probably do a
yeah, yeah.
biophysics degree?
There were a couple of aspects that entered into that, and it was interesting because it doesn't. I always say life makes so much more sense looking backward than it does looking forward. And and I look at some of the decisions that I made at an early age that turned out to be somewhat prescient, not because I knew what I was doing, but just because I was blessed or lucky, or found myself in the right spot. Um, my dad had a meeting with somebody one day, and for some reason, I guess he felt like he needed to bring me to the meeting, because it was, the the people that he was meeting with were, uh, I guess he didn't feel comfortable leaving me at home, and he thought, "Oh, it'd be good for you to meet this guy. Here's a young doctor." And at the time, I think I was like 12 years old, so I had never gone out on a date or anything. And I was at that age, where as a 12-year-old guy, you're starting to notice girls, and so um, we meet this guy, and the doctor was probably in his early 30s, and he had his wife with him. And I remember when I met his wife, I'm like, my God, she's perfect. Like, she's just, it's just, she's funny and intelligent and beautiful. And God, this guy, he hit it out of the park. And it was the first time I'd ever kind of had that reaction to, like, good for him. This guy really hit it out of the park. I guess that's what happens when you become a doctor. That, if you become a doctor, you'll end up with the right person. And what a crazy reason to make that thought process. But at the time, I was like, I should do that. Now, the irony of it is, it happened for me because I ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania. I get a degree in biophysics. In high school, I was at a party. I met Dot, who's my wife, and met her at a party. And I had that same reaction. I'm like, oh my God, she's perfect. I literally came home, told my parents I just met the girl I'm going to marry. And my parents were like, that's insane. You've never been out on a date with anybody. You're 15 years old. You can't even drive yet. And I was like, I totally just met the girl I'm going to marry. It took me 4 years to get her to go out with me. And then it took, she turned me down the first 3 times I asked her to marry. I think we were pretty young at the time, and so, but that was kind of how I ended up on the science stuff. I always liked science. I was always good at science. And really, science and math and music, they're the same thing. I mean, music is math, it's frequencies, it's in biophysics, really, um, when you really get down into the blocking and tackling of biophysics, it's very similar to metaphysics. Um, it's very vibrationally driven, and so it's actually not it comes off as like, who does biophysics and music? But the two are actually much closer to each other than you would think. And so I ended up
Interesting.
I published. I probably didn't have the grades to get into Penn, but they were the only biophysics program in Philly. And so at the time, I was doing well playing the bars in Philly, so moving would have prevented me from being able to pay my way through school. So I figured, how do I get in? And I started working in a lab. My uncle knew a fellow who had worked at this, who ran this lab, and he said, go meet this guy. His name was Britton Chance, and Britton was a guy. He had won an Olympic gold medal in '52 for yachting. He had, uh, I think his brother was the chairman of United Engineers. He had come in literally like second for the Nobel Prize in biochemistry. I mean, the guy was absolute genius. And so, and he rode his bike to the office every day, 7 in the morning. He rode his bike. So this was before there were stalking laws or anything. So I went and I figured I'm going to meet this guy. So I rode my bike into Penn and I waited at the elevator and I meet BC. We called him BC. It was Britton Chance. So I meet BC and I said, "Hey, I'd like to come work for you because I'm thinking if I work for the head of the biophysics department, I'm going to probably get in." So anyway, he said, "We don't, how old are you?" And I think I was like 15 at the time. And he goes, "Yeah, we hire grad students from college to do this stuff." And I said, "Well, I work really hard, do a really good job." And he said, "What do you know about spectrophotometers?" I obviously nothing. And so I said, "How would I learn that stuff?" And he said, "Well, if you did your homework, you'd know that I wrote a book on it." And so I said, "Is it in the library?" And he goes, "Yeah." And this was back when they could write you a note to get in the library if you're not a student. There were no computers or any of this stuff. So I went in and I skimmed the book. The next morning I meet him. And, and of course he's throwing me softballs, basically just asking me easy questions, knowing that I only had a day to go through this book. And I guess I did okay. And he said, "Wow, if only you understood mitochondria." And I was, "What's mitochondria?" So I said, "I'll bet you wrote a book on it." So he told me, and I went in, skimmed that book, and this dance went on for the week. And by the end of the week, it's oxidative phosphorylation and everything. So at the end of the week, he said, "Well, I'm going to be gone next week, but if don't bother coming by next week. We really don't hire kids, but I think your work ethic, your desire to succeed is going to help you in life, and I think you'll probably be somewhat successful with what you're doing." And so I'm sitting there thinking somebody's going to be running the lab next week. So I ended up the next week. I showed up and I knew a little bit about mitochondria, a little bit about the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, a little bit about spectrophotometers. So when I met with the guy who ran the lab that week, he hired me. And when BC came back, he was, I don't know if he's proud or angry, but he feigned anger and he actually like went off on me. But he said, "All right, now you're going to be my personal assistant." And I was thinking, that's great. That's what I wanted in the first place. So I worked for him, and I found one of his experiments did something at dry ice temperatures, but something different at liquid nitrogen temperatures. And so my thought at the time, obviously it didn't work, or I would have had the cure for cancer. But my thought at the time was if you could find where the results flip, and if you could do stuff with tumors at that temperature, you might be able to cure cancer. Now they've come up with better cures since then. But I ended up getting a paper published while I was still in high school, and then that got me into the University of Penn. And then I put out 2 albums while I was in school, and so it was basically music and biophysics, and got to know people as we were doing that stuff. And it's so when I got out of school, I figured, well, I decided not to become a doctor because I followed a doctor around for a week in a hospital, and I found that it was a surgeon, and in his case, I mean, some of the people died, and I just felt that the it's one thing if I have a bad day, we make a little less money or we lose money, or when it comes to music, if I have a bad day, somebody thinks I'm not any good, that's fine. But if as a doctor, if you have a bad day, sometimes people die, and I just didn't really feel like I had the emotional capacity to handle that. So but I took enough engineering courses that I was able to go into process control, sales, and then marketing. And I had a pretty good run at that. And then my wife encouraged
Okay.
me to go ahead and, she said, "Hey, you know what? Why don't you take your shot at music?" And I got lucky. So
So that actually, all of that's incredibly fascinating. And there's like a theme that's coming up, and that's tenacity. You know, you talked about the university and the professor and your wife Dot, and you even talked about the leagues and the labels and having to go back and being rejected. How important to your career and I mean life in general has that tenacity been? And what motivates you? Because a lot of people hear no and
yeah,
rejection and they give up. What keeps you
it's
motivated
fun.
and going?
Tenacity is a funny thing because I mean, you have. I think the thought process that a lot of people have is like, "Oh, this is tough. It's a grind." You have to enjoy the grind. I mean, if you don't like, I manage a couple of recording artists, and I mean that's one of the early things I tell them is that if you don't enjoy the struggle, if you don't enjoy the fact that every deal you ever do is probably going to start with no, and part of the process is navigating that so that you can, so that you can create value for everybody. If it's not a win-win, it's not worth doing. And so the idea is, what can you do to create more value for other people than what you're asking for in return? And then what can you do that will still generate enough for you to make it make sense to do it? Whether it's generating enough either financially or by happiness, or maybe creating opportunities that you can see down the road. And my experience, and a lot of this comes from faith, and I don't mean this in a in a preachy way. I feel very comfortable with my relationship with God. I happen to be a Christian. I always say I happen to be a Christian because I know some Christians who embarrass me, and I know and I know some non-Christians who embarrass me. So I always look at it and I figure that I'm comfortable with what I do. But I think that if you feel like you're on purpose, and if you feel like you're blessed with the opportunity, you're blessed with the opportunity to struggle and try to get through what you're trying to do, um, then you don't mind the adversity, and it doesn't. The adversity at that point becomes a gift, and tenacity becomes the natural response to it, and it's what you want to do as opposed to what you have to do. I get up every morning, and I say this all the
Yeah.
time. I look to my left, I see Dot. I get up, I go to the restroom, and I take a leak, and that's a good day. There are people who can't do that. There are people who go through their entire life and never meet somebody that they love who loves them back. There are people who have gout or kidney diseases or problems that they can't do something as simple as get up in the morning and go to the bathroom. And there's people who don't have a place to live. And so I figure that if you're fortunate enough to to be blessed and to recognize those blessings, then things like adversity or the idea that you have to overcome something, that's the fun part. That's what we get to do.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, it's funny, you just made me remember a math teacher I had in high school. I went to high school in Prague. I
Wow.
was very fortunate. I'm like you, like I'm very much a believer in
Yeah.
gratitude. I appreciate how much has been done for me and happens for me in life. Um, so this math teacher wrote on the board once, if that's the worst thing that happens to you today, then
Yes.
today is going to be a good day. And I lost a lot of these lessons until I had the last 2 years of my life unfold, and it was a very difficult time. There's just so many bad things that happened, but all of these things had to happen for me to really get into a place of gratitude. And just this morning, I was talking to my girlfriend, and we had a bit of a tiff, and I called her back, and I said, "Listen, I'm not mad. What you said upset me, and this is why I don't want to be fighting with you. It's not necessary." And we had an incredible conversation. And during that conversation came up this idea of challenges. I've realized that when hard things are happening, when life is quote unquote bad, that's actually good, because it is those struggles that actually change us, right? Like the good times, the easy times, they don't change us. And if I'm going to better myself as a human being, as a boss, as a mentor, as a partner, I need to have the adversity to learn how to better myself and to better
Yeah,
handle those situations.
yeah, exactly. And if you approach it with the idea that it's a blessing, it just makes the process fun. I mean, if you think about wins, whatever you would call a win in life, whether it's succeeding at a certain goal or something like that, those moments are pretty fleeting. And this actually comes back to what I was saying before, that
Yeah.
life makes way more sense when you look backward than it does when you look forward. Because when you look forward, there's, oh, it could go this way, it could go that way. I mean, if you think about the best way to go through a maze, you start at the end and you go backwards. There's only one way to go, and you can get out of the maze really quickly. If you're going into the maze, there's all these, this could happen, that could happen, and it sends you off into this journey of discovering horrors that could happen if this goes wrong or that goes wrong. If you think of it in terms of there is a plan, and whatever you happen to believe in that's designed that plan, uh, your job, is hopefully to do the best you can to get the best outcome. And if you approach it from a spiritual point of view, to glorify the creator that gave you the opportunity to be in this game in the first place. And if you think of it that way, the fleeting moments of success when you get an award, like I'm actually sitting in a hotel in Los Angeles right now, but like in my office, we got a bunch of platinum albums and trophies, all all the stuff that you win. There's like 35, 36 of them in my office. The interesting thing is I remember most of them. Like, you got this one, you got that one. Yeah, we did this cool thing with the Spice Girls. We did this cool thing with, whatever, I got to sing on an album or something like that. But that was a fun night. That's not, when you're lying in your deathbed, you're not going to be sitting there going, here, let me hold that award, or let me go see my diploma. You're basically going to be sitting there going, what really matters? Your relationship with God, your relationship with your wife, your relationship with your kids, your relationship with the people who work with and for you, the opportunities you've gotten to change people's lives in some way. And if you and if you can look back at that and say, hey, that's great. The moments just become these little fence posts along the way. They're not what life is about. Life's about the in between. And it's tough, because when you're facing a challenge, it's right up against your face. You're thinking, how do I get past this, or how do I get past that? And it's complicated depending on who you're surrounded by. Because if you're surrounded by people who embrace drama, um, and I'm probably brutal that way. I will not hang out with people who embrace drama. I won't do business with them. If I get the sense that everything is a crisis. If everything is a crisis, nothing matters. Uh, but it's hard when you're in the middle of one to see it that way. So I've been pretty fortunate that way.
Like, I like that saying. If everything is a crisis, nothing matters. That's something that I'm definitely going to take away from this. So you are tenacious, and you have faith, and you obviously have a lot of love and support from
Yeah.
your wife and family. How important was your relationship with your wife and the support from your wife as an entrepreneur
Oh,
just starting out? And the second part to that question is, how do you balance being an entrepreneur and being a family man? Because being an
yeah.
entrepreneur
I
takes a
mean,
lot of
it's
time.
funny. It's twofold. Number one, the relationship with my wife is everything. I mean, she's the nicest person I've ever met. If you don't have that, I don't. I mean, the three most important decisions that you're going to make in your life is who you believe to be the creator of the universe, and whether you have that relationship with that entity, the person you choose to marry, and what you choose to do for a living. Because that's going to determine, your relationship with your creator will determine whether you go through life scared, operating out of fear, doubt, and indecision, or whether you go through life empowered, believing that life's worth living. The relationship with your wife is going to determine whether you're happy every day. And it may also determine whether you have half as much money at the end of 3 years as you did, as you did when you started. And then the opportunity to make a living doing what you enjoy will I think it adds years to your life. It gets you up early in the morning and gets you working on what you're doing in a way where you happily achieve, as opposed to, you see all these people that are saying, I'll be happy when this happens, or I'll be happy when that happens. Those people will never be happy. If you approach things with the idea that I'm happy, I'm happy, I'm blessed, I get to do this. Every night there's 10 people in the ICU that would give anything to be you and me on our worst day. But when you approach it that way and you say, okay, so first let's start with gratitude. Let's thank God for what we have, and now let's get in the game. And maybe the game isn't going to play out exactly the way that we want it to, and nobody throws a no-hitter every time out. But you give it your best. You hope it works, and you hope that you can behave in a way that that allows you to always stay in the game. So win or lose, and regardless of how things work out, you put the relationships ahead of everything else. And I think with my wife in particular, that with any, I mean, you know this from your own thing. There's this entrepreneurial journey. It goes like that. You're sometimes you're ahead, sometimes you're behind. One of my mentors was a guy named Pat Croce. Still is a guy named Pat Croce. I love the guy. He was one of my first clients, and he became president of the Philadelphia 76ers. And he used to talk about the parade. You win a championship, you get a parade. But he would talk about the parade. And his point at the time, and I kind of embraced this. I jokingly call it the Pat Parade, both for him and for me. But the Pat Parade is, you're walking and there's nobody behind you. It's just you. And then you start succeeding, and there's a bunch of people going, yeah, go Pat, you're doing great. And the better you do, the more people there are in the parade behind you. And then if things don't work out, if things start getting sideways, there's fewer people back there now. It was never about the parade. It was never about the people behind you. It's about the journey that you're on, and the network of relationships, and the people whose lives you touch, and the opportunity to do something great and be part of something great. And I think if you see it that way, you're always going to be happy. And I'm fortunate with my wife that she's always believed in me, which is critical. I always say most guys, and this is a totally sexist thing to say probably, but I think most guys would rather have their wife or significant other believe in them than love them. And you assume that your girl or your guy is going to love you, but you don't necessarily assume that they're going to believe in you no matter what. And and it's sort of like Rocky, the movie. I think every guy wants to be Rocky. Being in Philly, Rocky is a big deal. But I think every guy wants to be that. Take the shot at the title, and you might get battered along the way, but to know that you have somebody there who believes in you the whole way, and then eventually go win, and but also recognize that you might not win right away. It might take a few. It might take a few shots to get there, but then hopefully, if you're lucky, it works out. And if it doesn't work out, you look at what you've learned along the way, or the relationships you formed along the way, and where it goes.
Yeah, I agree. It's belief in oneself, belief in faith, God, whatever it is that people believe in. It's all so important. Some people, that belief comes
Yeah.
from a parent. Maybe it's a sibling. Maybe it is the partner. I mean, it's very
Yeah.
important to believe in ourselves, but in those moments of weakness, in those sometimes days or weeks of doubt, having support, having that undying faith is critical. And the woman that I'm seeing now, she's the first woman that I've dated or been married to that has shown me that unconditional support and unconditional love. And man, it really adds fuel to the fire, because I might be able to push myself most of the time, but then you layer that on top of it. And not only are the days when I'm doubting now better, but then the days that I do believe in myself, I have even more tenacity and motivation because I
Yeah.
feel that support.
Yeah. That totally makes sense. I mean, I think the other piece of that is that there are probably going to be times where there's no reason for an outsider to believe you're going to succeed. And when that happens, I think that's where the relationship with your creator, and a sense of, am I on a mission? Am I doing the right thing? am I wasting my time, or is there a purpose I don't even understand? And that's what I look at. That's, again, it comes back to life making more sense when you look backwards. That I look back at some of the things
Yeah.
that didn't play out the way that I wanted them to play out, but they created opportunities that otherwise wouldn't happen. And and that's the kind of thing where
Yeah.
you, I think we all probably know people who have or have had cancer. I have a friend who, she beat cancer, and she refers to it as the best thing that ever happened to her. It's because for her, it gave her a chance to look at something and say, I have a purpose now. I can help other people that are dealing with this, who don't know how to deal with it and may not have the, the faith and the sense of gratitude that she has. And I think that when you can approach things that way, you would never looking forward go, gee, I hope I get cancer. But you can certainly look at it after the fact, and you can look back and say, hey, this created opportunities to help people that otherwise I wouldn't have. You know.
Yeah. I've referenced this in a previous chat, but I'm just finishing a book called Surrender Experiment. And in the book, this guy says that essentially, we make decisions in life based on what we like, what we don't
Right.
like, what we would want, what we wouldn't want. And if you remove that and start to look at what life is suggesting, then maybe it becomes easier to make those decisions. That doesn't mean you don't work and you don't grind, but if you're stuck and life keeps saying no, maybe there's something else that it's telling you to do. Um, there's another book that I'm reading now called Ikigai, and really it examines the blue zones where people are living the longest, and there's a place in Japan that has it's the number one spot for people living past 100, and Ikigai is this concept of your purpose, that these people find their purpose, and when they're fulfilled, they live longer, I guess,
Right.
because they're happier. And I think that all of these things tie in together, right? Like the tenacity, finding your purpose, being grateful, looking at life in a positive lens, so that when things happen that are quote unquote negative, you realize that actually, if this car accident didn't happen, that I
Yeah.
wouldn't have met this person and I wouldn't have had that opportunity. So be calm, be grateful, keep going. Sounds like you've had a really good head on your shoulders for a large part of your life. I feel like I developed that awareness late. A lot of the people that I admire seemed like they were born with this stuff. Do you think there's a magic solution to develop the
It's good
awareness?
to have
Is
good
it
mentors.
certain?
I think that, in my case, I had a very eclectic group of mentors, in the sense that, um some, especially working in the music business, and you there's a quite a cast of characters in the music business, and but I've also had some,
Yeah,
people like my dad, and there's a fellow named Moose that I refer to in the book, who, uh, just morally really good people. Just like, when I say more, like, really pretty much perfect, morally perfect people, that they always get it right. They have their priorities together, and they don't compromise their values. There's a fellow named Alan Harden, another guy named Greg Ham that we do stuff with in Nashville, that they ran Forefront Records, one of the Christian labels, and they're completely together. And then I have other mentors that are, um, that approach things differently. And the interesting thing is, I think that when you jump, when you put it all together into your own little jumbo, and you've got, like, here's how this guy would approach it, here's how that guy would approach it, here's how this other person would approach it. Um, and they, occasionally somebody will give you a gem that you can go the rest of your life with. I had a situation one time that was interesting. It was early on in the business. Things were not going well. All the labels were turning me down, and we were there was a proliferation of cable channels. They were building new buildings, which meant now all of a sudden they didn't need us to edit videos, because they were sticking the cable channels in the new arenas and stadiums. File sharing, and then streaming came along, so all of a sudden exposure wasn't worth what it used to be worth for the record companies. So, um, the business had changed, and I had not changed with the business at the time. And I was, kind of down on my luck. And it was probably the only time I can ever think of that I was starting to feel sorry for myself and feel like, this isn't going to work, and I'm letting down my wife and my kids. It hit a low point when I was in Los Angeles, and I was out of money, and my credit card stopped working. So I was sleeping in my car for most of that week. And I was trying to get labels on board. And of course, I looked like crap because I was sleeping in, it's not like I look good anyway, but you're sleeping in your car, you look terrible. So anyway, I got a call from a mentor of mine who, Bud Prager, was the guy's name. I mentioned him in the book. And he managed like Foreigner, and he was co-managing Megadeth. And he did some stuff with Bad Company. He was an old school, major music manager. And Bud called me up and he said, "Hey, I'm talking to people. They tell me you're looking pretty bad, and you're showing up." He goes, "Why don't you meet me at this restaurant?" And I didn't want to go meet him because I was embarrassed. I just looked, everything was falling apart. But I was also at a point where I felt like, you hit these points where you're like, is it worth it? Is it worth going on? And so I get together with him, and he said, and Bud, I don't think Bud was a particularly spiritual guy, but Bud says to me, Bud has passed away. He passed away the same year as my dad. I felt like I lost my two mentors, the same year, best mentors. But Bud says, "Do you know who David was?" And I said, "Yeah, he was a king, in the Bible." And I'm sitting there thinking, I didn't know Bud read the Bible, But anyway, he said, "Yeah, no, he wasn't a king. He was a shepherd." And then he met Goliath, and it was meeting Goliath and defeating Goliath that made him a king. And if if you can't look at these opportunities for what they are, they're opportunities. He goes, you're facing Goliath right now. You're facing a situation where you don't know how you're going to win. And any objective person will look at what you're doing and say, chances are you're not going to win. And he said, this is where you got to stare that giant down, kill him, take his crown, and make yourself king. And he said that, that's an exciting story. He said, if you think of it, if somebody is born into wealth, nothing wrong with being born into wealth, but let's say if somebody is born into wealth, they are handed everything, and then they meet the girl of their dreams, they get married, they live a nice life, they die a peaceful death, they have kids, they're happy. That story is boring. Like nobody wants to read that book. If you go to a sporting event and the team scores 52 points in the first quarter and they win the game 52-0, that is a boring game because you already, there's nothing to it. If you go to a sporting event and it's going back and forth, this guy's ahead, that guy's ahead, and it's back and forth. Or if you look at somebody's life and you say, okay, they're dealing with this, they're dealing with that, they have to overcome this or that, it's exciting. And his point was, don't boring, don't get to the end of that run and be sitting there going, oh God, why didn't you give me a boring life? His point was, embrace it. You have it anyway. You can either embrace it or you can cry about it. So his whole point was embrace it and go after it. And he goes, there's Goliath, go get him. And to me that was really valuable because up until then, I always looked at adversity as a gift, but I also always had this sense that ultimately I'll succeed. And it was the one point in my life where I started looking at it and I go, I don't see how I'm going to succeed. And the interesting thing is, if you actually believe that you're surrounded, embraced, protected, and loved by the creator of the universe, why would you ever worry about that? I mean, it's like if you have a disease and you believe you're surrounded, embraced, protected, and loved by the creator of the universe, can that creator of the universe get a couple cells to behave better? I think so. If you're dealing with a business challenge, can the creator of the universe make things align in your favor? Yeah, I think so. Does it mean it's going to happen right away? It's like, no, everybody knows God's delays aren't God's denials. But if you go at it with the approach of we will ultimately prevail at whatever we're doing. And it goes back to like looking at life, looking backwards, going, hey, I'm not going to get to the end of the run and be the guy who gave up when when maybe that biggest victory was right in front of me. Yeah. So
Yeah, faith plays such a huge part in a lot of, what we're doing. And it's, again, it's faith in so many different ways. It's faith in self, faith in God, faith in your idea, faith in the team that you're working with. You can't give up. A lot of people will say there's no
yeah,
plan B. I was destined to succeed. You have to believe in that, and you have to inspire yourself to keep going regardless. It sounds like that's been something that's constantly been there for you. I do love the idea of having, mentors and guidance, because a lot of people don't have that. You mentioned the example of people born into money. My parents were not. I was, in the sense that they had
right.
worked their butts
To
off
create the
to have
opportunity. Yeah,
careers and afford, yeah, create opportunities. But they also then, as mentors, said, we're not going to hand everything
right.
to you on a silver platter. We're going to show you things and we'll teach you things so that you can then have, hopefully, a better setup for success going forward.
Yeah,
That's important. That's that guidance. That's that education that's passed down. And I think that, I mean, ultimately, that's what I'm trying to do
yeah,
here, is inspire other people, educate other people within music or not. Um, I'm sure you and I could, wax philosophical for hours. Why don't we come
yeah,
back to POC Media? Because I'm really fascinated about, music. Then there's university. You marry young. There's all this incredible stuff happening, and then it kind of goes like
yeah.
experiential marketing. Sure, that's the general term for everything that you're doing, but sports and then music. Yeah, how did you start to meet people who went on to own teams, and how did you talk to labels? Because there are so many artists out there who don't even know how to talk to a publicist, let alone can imagine talking to a
Yeah,
president of a label.
it's interesting. One of them, and this, I guess the trick is it has to be respectful, but at the same time, there's most of the people that I see who are very successful at what they do don't spend a lot of time caring what other people think. And it's not that they, and when I say not caring what people think, I mean, no good person wants to hurt people or not, not care if another person is happy and stuff. But people are going to form whatever opinion of you or whatever opinion of your goal that they can. And that opinion rarely has anything to do with you. It's usually a projection of what they've experienced or how they've been raised or how they've seen other people treated when they win or lose. So I think one of the things that I always kind of had a healthy dose of, whatever, if I'm working on something and somebody thinks it's stupid, maybe it is. I don't know, but I don't spend a lot of time worrying about, whether someone else's opinion of what I'm doing is going to be that I'm on target or I'm off target. And the fact is, a lot of times you don't even know if you're on target or off target until you're so far down the road that you look back and go, God, that was brilliant. That thing I did over there. Um, I snuck backstage at a concert at the Spectrum one time to meet the artist and ended up back at the hotel with the artist, sitting at a piano playing my songs for her, pitching her my songs. That resulted in me getting the Best New BMI Songwriter Award. When I look at it now, that's insane. I mean, you outrun the cops. You find out what hotel they're at. You go to the hotel. You'd probably get arrested for that now. But at the time, there were no stalking laws. So, you just go do it. And that opened up all sorts of doors for me in the contemporary Christian music business and the country music business. We were already working pretty heavily in the rock business. So I think that, in terms of how you get to know these people and work with them, I think part of it is if everybody is already on their way up, and also if you have people vouching for you. I've always had the belief that life is bigger than whatever it is you're doing. So if, even when I was trying to get record companies on board, it was like that was going to be significant for my life. But, it doesn't change the world. I mean, we're creating content to put on scoreboards at football games or hockey games or whatever. That's not a big deal. But when the industry started to change, my thought was, instead of saying, oh, what we've been counting on is going away, I looked at it and said, well, what if we brought in a couple of coders and we could put something together that we could license to like Fox Sports or, or some of these other, broadcast outlets that we would start working with. And that in hindsight, those are the things that if you cared what people thought, or if you wanted to play it safe, you wouldn't do that, because every time you take a shot at something, my dad always used to use the expression that turtles only get move forward when their heads are out, but that's also when they get killed. So the idea is, if you're going to move forward, you're going to be putting yourself in a precarious position. But the beauty of it as an entrepreneur is you're not going to get killed. You might get made fun of. And if you don't care about that, then you just, you do stuff. And what I have found is, a lot of times my most vocal critics, the people who looked at what we were doing, first of all, the ones who were saying, don't do it, it might not work, probably cared, and they didn't want to see me get hurt. And the people who were saying, don't do it, it isn't going to work because that's a stupid idea, they just weren't seeing the future that I was seeing. And so I didn't really spend a lot of time worrying about that. But I think that if you go at things with the approach of, I'm doing something, it's going to help an industry, or it's going to help people, or it's fun, it's not going to hurt anybody, and it's fun, uh, you throw deep and see what happens. And the other part of it is that, again, like I was saying before, nobody throws a no-hitter every time out. Everything you do doesn't have to work. It's just you can't make fatal errors. You can't do things that are going to jeopardize, like my 7 rules. I've got 7 rules. It's like, mom, dad, God love you no matter what. Fear, doubt, and indecision kill, but they die in the presence of faith. So you have to have faith you're going to succeed. Relationships determine results. Know what you want most. Don't put what you want now ahead of what you want most. Don't put yourself in a position where you're tempted or forced to put what you want now ahead of what you want most. And then don't give up. And I characterize that as, your heart knows what you want most. Your head knows what you want now. So don't get the two confused when you're working on things. And my experience has been, everybody that I see who succeeds is doing that. Everybody who really has a passion in their heart for what they want to do, and they know that that's the most important thing. When the thing comes up that I'd like to do that, or I'd like to try this, they have the self-discipline to stay with what their heart's telling them is the right thing all along. And I think that when you take that approach, the opinions of, I guess what they call it, the good opinions of other people, at that point, they're not that relevant, because those people are maybe operating out of fear, doubt, or indecision. They're projecting their own anxieties or their own fears onto what you're doing. And maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but there's nobody who ever goes to their grave saying, thank God I didn't take any chances. That's most people are going to regret the things they didn't go after more than the things they tried to do that didn't work. So
Yeah. I mean, there's the old adage,
yeah,
nothing
yeah,
ventured, nothing gained, right? If you take a life of indecision and not taking risks,
yeah,
then nothing will happen. You have to put yourself out there. You have to go and ask
right,
Dot
yeah.
like 5 times to go out with you.
Well, even that, it was interesting. The third time she turned me down, I said to her, because I knew that part of it was we were young, and we probably were too young to get married. If my kids at 23 said they were getting married, I'd be like, what are you talking about? But the interesting thing was, the third time she turned me down, I said, why are you turning me down? I said, I get the sense like we're in love, right? She goes, yeah. And I said, we're both pretty successful. Well, she ended up becoming an audit manager at Arthur Andersen. She had like a 4.0 at Villanova University. Smart, wonderful, lovely person, wonderful family. And the funny thing she said at the time was, she said, well, you're not that nice. And I started laughing when she said that. I'm like, I'm not that nice. I'm not even sure what that means, And she said, well, and then I started thinking about it for a second. And I grew up with a wonderful family. But we would, you'd be sarcastic, or, everybody sort of would take their, is a fun loving family, and probably not an overly sensitive family. When I met Dot's family, they're like Dot. They're the kindest people I've ever met in my life. Now, I think that my parents and my sister are among the kindest people I've ever met in my life, but not as openly maybe not exactly the same as Dot's family and what she was used to growing up around. And also, I looked at what I was doing to get through school. I was working in bars. I mean, Dot wasn't working in bars, and so when I looked at it, I started thinking that you end up, in my case, I was probably a little bit quicker to respond with sarcasm or with you know, more caustic responses from time to time. But the funny thing was, what I said to her was, I said, "Oh, is that all? It's just that you think I'm not that nice." And she goes, "Yeah." She goes, "You're a good person. I see what you do. You help people." But she goes, if somebody says something, that you think is dopey, you don't mind telling them that it's kind of dopey. Uh, which I never thought of as not being nice. I just looked at it as like, if somebody says something silly, you can call them out on it. But I said, well, gee, if that's all I have to do is fix that, I'll do that. If that's all I have to do is not be sarcastic, not not respond to people with the first thing that pops into my head, and I'll end up with you for the rest of my life. That's a pretty good trade-off. Let's do it. And I mean, I think she made me a better person literally on the spot. And it was interesting because and again, I mean, I came from a very nice family, but I think that Dot probably looked at it and said, in her family, I don't think anybody ever said anything negative to anybody. I think everybody was being uplifted on everything. In my family, everybody was being uplifted, but also in a good way, challenged. It was like, come on, you gotta go do
Yeah.
this, more like coach, and which is its own form of love. My dad, I remember one time, I mentioned this in the book, my dad one time saying to me, he was being critical of my business at a point when things weren't working. And he was being not critical of my business, he'd been critical of me. And my parents were married 52 years, and great marriage, great parents. I have a great sister. And but he was saying, like, I can't believe you're not, I can't believe you're screwing up here, you're screwing up there, you're not succeeding. And at the time I said, that's too easy. You're sitting outside the ring. I'm getting my head bashed in here. And the last thing I need while I'm getting my head bashed in is to hear my dad tell me I'm a loser. That's terrible. And what he said to me at the time was brilliant. He goes, if you can't handle somebody who loves you and is rooting for you all the time, telling you that you need to step up, then you're not ready for the world anyway. You should thank me for keeping you out of the fight that you can't win. If you believe you can win that fight, then you should be able to handle a little bit of criticism from somebody who loves you unconditionally and wants to see you succeed. And that's a very different take on kindness. I mean, in one sense, that might be the kindest thing a father can do, is tell a kid, I believe in you and I'm frustrated because I want to see you succeed. Um, as opposed to patting you on the head and telling you it's going to be okay when it isn't going to be okay. And I was fortunate because my mother, uh, she would hug you and give you a pat on the head and tell you, don't worry, it's going to be okay. My dad would say, if you need a hug, mom's in the other room. Here's what you better do. You better come up swinging, and you better do this and this, and so I always say parenting is a team sport. We probably, Dot and I have a similar dynamic with our own kids, that, Dot is the unconditional love, unconditional kindness. I I'm the unconditional love. And yeah, we're going to be kind, but if you're screwing up, I'm going to tell you, and encourage you to get it on track. If I don't have the answers, find somebody who does, but get it on track and make it work. You know.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think a balance is so important. It was such a silly ad, but when I was in university, uh, I think it was Budweiser. It was one of the beer companies came out with an ad campaign where there was a guy at a bar with his friends, and he had a big chart, and he was doing Venn diagrams, and he was pointing to the middle, and it's like it's about taste, and it's about how cold it is, and it's about the flavor, right here in the middle, it's about balance, and that was the key thing, that it's about balance. And I've taken that into my life so wholeheartedly, to the point that we have a saying internally: everything is love and logic. You have to do things
Yeah.
from a place of love, and then you have to layer logic on top of that, and that gives you the full picture. And as a parent now, I mean, I shouldn't say now, I've been like this for a while, but I'm still improving. I'm still trying to get better every day, but I try to always go
Yeah.
back to firm but fair. You have to be firm, but you have to be fair. You can give your child the love and support, but you also have to let them fail and learn. They have to know that that it's unconditional love, but if they've been
Yep.
bad, you explain why. And it's so hard to find that balance, but it's so important. And I think that it goes to not just family and relationships, but
Yeah, well,
also
business
business.
and I mean business in
Uh,
a sense is much like a family. I mean, like I said, my family was amazing. My parents were wonderful. My sister's always been wonderful. I never questioned whether I was loved unconditionally. I never questioned whether they were rooting for me. And I think that's critical as a kid growing up. You have to believe that there's somebody there who wants to see you succeed and believes in you and loves you no matter what. It doesn't mean that people aren't going to question whether you're going to succeed. It's just and the thing is, you can't be so sensitive that you worry about that. I mean, to some extent, what my dad told me was correct. If you can't handle the criticism of people who love you, the sincere positive criticism of people who love you, then what are you going to do when you're actually in the lion's den? And so
yeah.
it's important to be able to handle that. I just noticed I have to in about 5 or 6 minutes. I have to, and I apologize for this. I have to jump on another thing I'm doing, but is does that mess things up or is that? Oh, okay.
No, no, no. You're in high demand. That's a good thing. Why don't we just wrap up then, and then you can be on your way. I did want to talk about the industries and which industry you found to be the most challenging, whether it was music or sports or film and television. I also wanted to ask, running a business, what's harder, starting, growing, or
It's
maintaining?
funny there. Every phase of a business to me is fun in the sense that starting a business is exciting because there's a 80% chance you're going to fail in the first 5 years and an 80% chance you'll fail in the next 5 years, which means you're in the top, 1 or 2% if you're just in business 10 years later. Forget about whether you're even wildly successful. If you're just in business 10 years later, you've just beaten the odds because you're at the 20% of 20%. You're down into that 4% range. And it's exciting, but you're so passionate when you're starting the business, you'll stay up all night. I mean, I was young at the time. I'd go on 3 hours sleep, and on Tuesdays I didn't go to bed. I just stayed up all night and worked all night, and I never minded it. It was because I loved what I was doing. I love the people we do it with, the people we do it for, and you're passionate about it. Running the business gets tricky because then you start stepping back and managing other people doing the stuff that you used to do. And where I see some people running into traps is if you love what you're doing, if you actually love the day-to-day thing of what you're doing, sometimes it's hard to step away. And if you're hiring other people to jump in and do that work, it's hard to let them just do it. If my philosophy on running a business, the running process is it's the same as having a happy marriage. The first step is choose well. Choose the right
Yeah,
person, and the rest will take care of itself. If you choose the wrong person, you're out of luck because it doesn't matter what you do; it's not going to work. So the first thing is you choose the right people, and then with a business, I think you let them do what they're great at, and you let them know that you're there to support them in any way that you can. And then sometimes that experience or the network of relationships that you have. I mean, like in our case, I've got a team of people that are far smarter than me, that are doing every aspect of what POC Media does. But there's times when you need to get the president of a record company on the phone, and I've got his cell phone, and he takes my calls. And the other people who work with me didn't grow up with that person. It's not that they wouldn't take their calls if they say, "Hey, we're from POC Media," and Pat said the call, but uh, but it's a trickier process. I can sometimes cut through the clutter in 5 minutes, where if I ask people working for me to go through that process, it may or may not play out. And I think that once the business gets to a point where you've really hit a critical mass, where you're like, for instance, you're mentioning sports or music or broadcast, um, they're all kind of different versions of the same animal in the sense sports, you tend to have a pretty competitive environment because it's what makes great athletes, and a lot of people who go work for sports organizations are either athletes or attorneys. And so there is already a sense of competition. I like to operate on the creative plane as opposed to, like, in music, there's always room. There's always room for one more. And I think in terms of broadcast side, there's not always room for one more. And a lot of the people that you're dealing with are artists in their own right. These producers, these music supervisors are just as creative as the person who writes the song in terms of how they use it and how they fit it in. And I think the tricky part is, as long as you can step back and be respectful of what they're doing and admire what they're doing, and recognize that, the people producing, we do some work with Thursday Night Football and with, Monday Night Hockey in Canada, on Amazon Prime. So if I'm looking at it now, I've been blessed with the opportunity to go to a number of these Thursday Night Football games with the Amazon team. They're bringing in hundreds of people, and it's like you're bringing your own town to their town. You're taking over the city, and you're bringing all these trucks onto the stadium and stuff. And it's so easy with POC Media to get, mired in this. We do music, we're clearing the music, we're helping with supervision. And then you get down there and you see there's tons of camera people, there's mic people on the field, there's people mixing, there's line producers, there's catering, there's logistics, there's the people connecting all the cables and making everything work. And this little piece that we have that happens to be the music that's important. And then you start to meet the hosts of the shows, like the announcers for the games, and they're so great at what they're doing. Like it's like the sign of a great referee is you don't notice that they're there. And the sign of a great announcer is that you don't realize how hard it is to do what they do. They're hearing things in their earpieces, and they're looking at charts, and they're talking, and they're doing it so fluidly, and they're amazing at what they do. And then they can still, in the midst of all of that hurricane going on around them, when you bump into them in the tunnels or something, they're nice. And you look at it and you're like, this is why I'm blessed that I get to do this. So I love working with all of those groups. And I think the trick to working with them is recognizing what it takes to be a great athlete and what it takes to run broadcasting for a great sports organization, what it takes, to be a record executive, and to be able to not only run a business, but to be able to understand the heart of an artist. And what I always say with, in managing artists is, what you love about artists is they think differently. What drives you nuts about artists is that they think differently. They see things, the world, differently. But it's such a beautiful thing, because every artist that I know has a take on life that I feel like my life got better because I got to know them. And if they're effective as an artist, they can convey that to the outside world, and other people see it too. And they can change lives in doing it. Athletes change lives by inspiring people, and being there for that kid who wants to be an athlete and doesn't think they can do it, and they get inspired by meeting somebody who says, yeah, you can do this. You can pull this off. But they're all different, but it's fun.
I really appreciate all of the valuable insight. I feel like there's actually a part two here. So I think we should stay in touch. Let's stay in touch and talk a bit more about the industry and entrepreneurship in the future. Until then, stay happy, stay healthy, stay grateful, and all the best.
You too. And I'll be praying for continued success with what you're doing. I love what you're doing and your approach to doing it, Chris. So thanks for letting me be part of it today. And definitely, if you have time to do another one with me, I'd love to connect with you. And I don't get to Vancouver that often, but I get to the West Coast a lot. So let's try to coordinate something when we're somewhere near the same city. I'll come out and let's get together.